As you will have noticed from this channel, I do try and cover as wide a range of historical topics connected to the area as possible, from buildings, events, killers, to eccentrics, and even military topics. But there are two areas I feel I have been rather lacking in when it comes to covering topics. One of those is stories from the county of Suffolk itself, and the other are the stories of women from the area who have made their mark on history. Well, today I'll be making up on both of these points by covering the life of a woman who rose to lead one of the main organisations fighting for women's suffrage in the country, only to now largely be overlooked by their more radical counterparts. Although being most famous with her married name, Millicent was born Millicent Garrett on the 11th of June 1847 to Newton Garrett, a ship owner and businessman, and his wife Louisa Dunnell. She was the eighth of their 11 children, 6 daughters and 5 sons, 4 of whom, all daughters, would survive infancy. Among them Elizabeth, born in 1836, and a woman who will get her own presentation very soon, as trying to mention everything she did in the field of medicine in a passing comment in this video would be a great disservice to her. Millicent was born and grew up in the coastal town of Aldborough, and came from a very happy and politically active home, with her family being described. The Garretts were a close and happy family, in which children were encouraged to be physically active, read widely, speak their minds, and share in political interests of their father, a convert from conservatism to Gladstonian liberalism, a combative man and a keen patriot. This was a great springboard for the life she had to come, and Millicent became involved and interested in the idea of women's suffrage from a young age, later saying, "I cannot say I became a suffragist, I always was one. From the time I was old enough to think at all about the principles of representative government." It may have been something that was always generally burning in her mind, but the main driving force would come after being introduced by her older sister Elizabeth to Emily Davis, one of the earliest women's rights campaigners in the country, and a woman who would set them both on their paths that they would follow for the rest of their lives. During the meeting with the 2 young girls and their mother, she is reported to have said, "It is quite clear what has to be done. I must devote my life to securing higher education." Then telling Elizabeth it was her job to open up the medical profession for women, and finally turning to young Millicent. "After these things are done, you must see about getting the vote. You are younger than we are, Millie. You must attend to that." Of course, for any of this to take place, both of them needed to be educated well, and the family most certainly saw to this. After spending the first few years of her life being taught locally, Millicent, aged 12 in 1858, was sent off to boarding school in Blackheath, run by a Louisa Browning, near where by this time Elizabeth herself was also residing. While in Blackheath, as well as the classes you would expect, she also attended sermons by the Suffolk-born Anglican priest, John Frederick Denizen Maurice, a forward-thinking and socially aware man for his time, who greatly inspired her way of seeing religion. By 1865 she had well established herself in London, and through people like Emily Davis she was making her mark in liberal circles, and attending lectures by politician John Stuart Mill, who had been calling for women's suffrage since the 1830s, and the pair soon became friends, with her later saying that he kindled tenfold my enthusiasm for women's suffrage. The following year saw her taking her first direct steps into this world, helping Emily Davis circulate a petition calling for Parliament to enfranchise women householders, the first petition in the country that was about women's suffrage. Millicent worked hard, collecting as many signatures as she could, despite at the time not being old enough to sign it herself, being only 19. It was through these people, especially John Mill, she was introduced to Henry Fawcett, the Liberal Party MP for Brighton, Professor of Political Economy at Cambridge, and a keen believer in women's rights. The pair shared much in common, and not just when it came to politics within their own country. They had both been keen supporters of the Union in the American Civil War which had just ended, and admired Abraham Lincoln greatly, with Millicent saying with the news of his assassination that his death was a greater loss than any crowned head in Europe. Millicent first took a job working as his secretary, reading out his academic papers at seminars and making notes during House of Commons debates, as Henry had been blinded in 1858 during a shooting accident. In truth, Henry at first had been interested in Elizabeth, not Millicent, but the former had soon turned him down, as she was far too busy with her medical studies to take a husband. But over the time he would spend with Millicent, an attraction and connection grew, despite Henry being 14 years older than her, until the pair married on the 13th of April 1867, a marriage that was described as one of perfect intellectual sympathy. The pair soon became known for their radical beliefs on women's suffrage, proportional representation, individualism, free trade principles, and trade unions. They ran two houses, one in London and the other in Cambridge, and shared the responsibilities the best they could. Despite the happiness 1867 would bring her, Millicent would also suffer sadness in the form of the death of her eldest sister Louisa, aged just 32. 1867 would bring two large steps forward into her life. The first was Millicent joining the London Suffrage Committee, and the second was the birth of their one and only daughter, Philippa, who, as you can probably imagine, was taught and encouraged by her parents to do the best she could be, and would go on to be the first woman to obtain the top score in the Cambridge Mathematics Tripos exams. 17th of July 1869 brought the first pro-suffrage meeting held publicly in London, and among its speakers was Millicent, her first public speech of any kind, and was widely praised by all who heard her. Critics were disarmed by her appearance and manner, demure, slight, graceful, responsible, a youthful but composed figure, with a mass of amber hair and a clear, silvery, and expressive speaking voice. She would follow this up by giving a similar speech in her husband's constituency in Brighton in March 1870. Henry had always been keen for her to follow her passions of writing as well, and 1870 would also mark her first full publicated work, Political Economy for Beginners, although she had an article of hers published in Macmillan's magazine first in 1868. But this pamphlet was hugely successful, and sold well for the next 41 years. Her next work came 2 years later, co-written by her husband, Essays and Lectures on Social and Political Subjects, with her contributing 8 essays. She was also a founder and served on the council of Newnham Hall, now Newnham College in Cambridge, one of the first places in England specifically dedicated for the education of women. Millicent and Henry became the subject of a painting by Ford Madox Brown in 1872 that now hangs in the National Portrait Gallery. And incredibly, throughout all of this, Millicent still found time to care for her extended family. 4 of her cousins had been made orphans at a very young age, and her, along with another one of her sisters, Agatha, was raising them. One of her first victories in the world of women's rights came from campaigning for the introduction of the Married Women's Property Bill that allowed married women to have some control over their own finances. It had been a cause that was very close to Millicent, following having her bag snatched from her while in Waterloo Station in 1877. The thief was caught pretty quickly and was charged with stealing from the persons of Millicent Fawcett a purse containing £1, 18 shillings and 6pence, noted down as the property of Henry Fawcett, with her later saying, "I felt as if I had been charged with theft myself." Sadly, she would suffer a great setback on the 6th of November 1884, when Henry died aged 51 from palsy, causing her to retreat from public life for about a year and sell both of the family homes in London and Cambridge, moving in with her sister Agnes, who was also a committed suffragist and one of the first female interior designers in Britain. After she had come to terms with the loss, she returned to public and threw herself into the fight for women's suffrage, becoming a key member in groups that would eventually become the Women's Local Government Society. Despite how forward-thinking Millicent was in many ways, it must be remembered that she was very much a child of the Empire, and saw any setback as a disaster to it, and this would lead to her leaving the Liberal Party in 1886 and joining the breakaway Liberal Unionist Party, when the Liberals came out in support for Home Rule for Ireland, something that she thought would bring chaos to both England and Ireland if it was to happen, and gave several speeches against it. She was thrust even more into the public spotlight 4 years later, in 1890, when Linda Becker, a key leader in the suffrage movement in Britain, died aged 63. And Millicent, who had now been involved in the movement fully since the age of 22, stepped up to replace her. A daunting prospect, but one she took well, and over the next few years of her life she grew in popularity and renown, speaking, campaigning and writing. In 1897 she was able to form a coalition of movements, including the National Central Society for Women's Suffrage and the Central Committee for the National Society of Women's Suffrage to rejoin each other, having followed their split in 1888, as well as taking many smaller groups into this movement and renaming it the National Union for Women's Suffrage Societies. making them the largest organisation of this kind in the country. Although, once again, as her political and public life made great steps forward, her personal life took a hit. This one being the passing of her father, aged 81. Millicent was granted an honorary doctorate of law by the University of St Andrews in 1899. As mentioned before, Millicent considered herself a patriot and was most certainly a child of empire. So when in the dying months of 1899, a war broke out in South Africa with the Boer farmers of the Orange Free State and the Transvaal, she, like many, supported swift action to end the war. But with few troops in the colony itself, regiments from across the empire were now being mobilised and sent into action against what was described as a cobbled-together army of farmers, African auxiliaries, and a few thousand foreign volunteers. Some claimed it would be over in a couple of months, others claimed it would be an adventure or a gentleman's war, and as the troops marched out singing Goodbye Dolly Gray, there were few who realised what it was going to turn into. The fighting slogged on for over 2 years, leaving 99,284 dead, wounded, sick or missing on the side of the British Empire, 30,198 dead or captured from the forces of the Boer Republic, and worse, 46,370 civilians dead, 26,370 of those coming from the conditions of the British camps. Now, this is not a video to discuss these camps, and I am certainly not qualified enough to even try. But if you are interested, please find in the description below a link to a far more in-depth discussion by someone far more qualified to do so. You may wonder why I brought this up at all, but these camps would bring Millicent to South Africa, following the news of their conditions being broken to the public by Emily Hobhouse, and in July 1901, Millicent was sent leading a group of women to the country to see if what was being said was true. The first time women had been given such a duty in wartime, and her report would be published in 1902. She widely condemned the use of the scorched earth policy being used by the British Army, where they destroyed crops, farms and homes, so they couldn't be used to aid the Boer fighters. She did report that the conditions and running of the camp were leading to the needless deaths of those being held there, but also mentioned what she called the insanitary habits of the Boer people as playing a factor as well. Given her opinions and that making enemies within the British public would have made her fight for suffrage even harder, it should come as no shock that her reports did not go as far as many wished it probably had, leading to many of her critics and anti-war campaigners to be considering it a whitewash to please the government. But while she sailed for the Cape, a very different war was starting to break out among the ranks of the National Union for Women's Suffrage Societies. The group had been established under the principle of fighting for women's rights in a peaceful and legal manner, holding meetings and talks to either get their points across or to introduce bills to Parliament. But this was not sitting well with some. This disagreement and debate would boil away under the surface until 1903, were led by mother and daughter Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst. A number of the group's members left, forming the Women's Social and Political Union, more than willing to take militant and illegal action to get their aim, and would go down in history as the Suffragettes, with each of them eventually going too far for some of their own members, splitting again in 1907 due to the violent actions being undertaken. As well as the split of the organisation, 1903 would also bring the death of her mother, Louisa, aged 90. 1907 saw Millicent voted in as president for the NUWSS, a position she would go on to hold for over 2 decades. And it was her attitude and demeanour while leading this group that won over many men to the cause. Millicent and her supporters, known as Suffragists, supported the best they could the suffragettes, but as time went on and they grew more violent, they were forced to distance themselves from them, both due to their actions, and that how rather than electing a leader, they were controlled almost solely by one family, with Millicent later writing in her memoir, What I Remember, "I could not support a revolutionary movement, especially as it was ruled autocratically, at first by a small group of 4 persons, and latterly by 1 person only. In 1908, this despotism decreed that the policy of suffering violence but using none was to be abandoned. After that, I had no doubt whatever that what was right for me and the NUWSS was to keep strictly to our principles of supporting our movement only by argument, based on common sense and experience, and not personal violence or law-breaking of any kind." Her disavowing of the actions of the New Radicals was a practical one, if nothing else. She believed that their violent and illegal actions would only push more and more people away from the cause, and would even make the goal of limited suffrage impossible. Publicly, though, she kept her opinions to herself, not wanting to give her opponents ammunition to attack the whole movement with. But in private she was far more vocal, calling the storming of the Houses of Parliament in 1909 an immoral and dastardly thing to have done. Despite fighting for the same cause, the NUWSS and the WSPU, and later on the third group, the Women's Freedom League, would remain firm rivals. When the Pankhursts chose the slogan, "Deeds, not words," for their new organisation, Millicent was quick to respond with a new slogan of their own, "Law-abiding suffragists." And this in many ways helped them retain the great deal of public support and popularity that they had been gathering. With the NUWSS having around 50,000 members, something that Millicent called a grand Freemasonry between different classes of women, while the WSPU never grew to anything more than about 5,000. Although they were able to find common ground, with Millicent even holding a dinner in the Savoy in honour of the first 10 suffragettes to be imprisoned. And they did work together at times when they really needed to, with the WFL, whose actions fell in the middle of both groups, often acting as a go-between. Sadly though, even this was too much to ask. And following the arsons and bombings carried out by suffragettes in 1912, Millicent was done with their movement, although she did condemn the heavy-handed actions of the police and government while dealing with them. Along with the continued struggle for women's suffrage, the early 20th century saw Millicent turn her attention to many other things she saw as wrongs. From trying to end child abuse in the home, raising the age of consent, the excluding of women from courtrooms during certain types of cases, ending prostitution that she, like many, considered the white slave trade, and the double standards when it came to sexually transmitted diseases, that a woman, especially one from the working class or a prostitute, if found to have passed on to a man, could face imprisonment, while vice versa, there was no such punishment, a law that she was fundamental in getting overturned. And she would also be the first woman to speak in an Oxford Union debate. As the 1910s came round, rumblings in Europe began, and alliances were being formed, with war seeming to grow closer and closer. But for the fight for women's suffrage in Britain, there was a glimmer of hope. Many MPs had been won over that at least some women deserved the right to vote, with even the Prime Minister, Henry Asquith, agreeing that something needed to be done, only to go back on his word in December 1911 and decide not to call for a vote on it. This action angered Millicent, but was quick to point out her more militant counterparts were likely to take it much worse than she had. If Mr. Asquith desired to revive a violent outbreak of militancy, he could not have done more to promote his end. Possibly in response to everything that had happened over the last few years, from the broken promises to the actions of the suffragettes, Millicent, now 66, led a mass demonstration of 70,000 in London's Hyde Park in July 1913. It was widely praised for how peaceful it was. For all the ongoing work she was doing, Millicent was given a brooch, engraved for steadfastness and courage. The tensions growing in Europe exploded in summer 1914, and the world was thrown into a war like none had ever known. Much like many had done some 14 years before, men were marching off from all over the country. This time the song was Tipperary, but as many said, this one would be the short war they were hoping for. They were once again gravely mistaken. When the war broke out, her rivals, the WSPU, ceased all activity for the duration and threw themselves behind the fight. This left Millicent in a rather difficult position. She wasn't a pacifist, but with her action using more gentle and legal approaches to things, she had attracted a great deal of pacifists to them. And directly supporting the war may lead to another split on her hands. This led to the NUWSS carrying on their work, shifting their normal talking points to showing off the work being done by women as nurses in ammunition factories and other services across the country she described as sustaining the vital force of the nation. She also encouraged her members to do their bit for the war effort. Women, your country needs you. As long as there was any hope for peace, most members of the National Union probably sought for peace, and endeavoured to support those who were trying to maintain it. But we have another duty now. Let us show ourselves as worthy of citizenship, whether our claim to it be recognised or not. Her call to action was not taken well by the pacifists and the anti-war members of the NUWSS, with around 20,000 resigning, and others calling for her to be removed from power, but she kept her place through a special vote called in June 1915. She was pleased with the work undertaken by women during the war years, saying, "It was almost ridiculous to watch the amazement of the ordinary man when he saw how rapidly women learnt a man's job and how their output frequently exceeded, and exceeded largely, the output of the men working the same machinery for the same number of hours." From May 1916 onward, she and her members wrote often to the now Prime Minister David Lloyd George and other ministers calling for a vote, with her even becoming friends with the new Prime Minister. But then, once again, as if it was clockwork, just as her movement went forward, personal tragedy struck. This time, her sister Elizabeth passing away in 1917, aged 81. It is hotly debated which group really did the most for gaining the vote for women, but either way, on the 6th of February 1918, the Representation of the People's Act 1918 was passed in Parliament. That, as well as giving the voting right to all men over the age of 21, whether they owned property or not, it took the first step onto the path of giving the same to women, granting voting rights to women aged over 30, who resided within the constituency or occupied land or premises with a rateable value of above £5, or whose husband did. This granted the right to vote to around 6 million women. An extended local government franchise to include women over the age of 21. Millicent was in the public box for the debate which led to the vote and the passing of the law, later calling it the greatest moment of her life. The following year, in March 1919, Millicent, now 72, stepped down from her position as leader of the NUWSS, with it being renamed the National Union of Societies for Equal Citizenship, and elected Eleanor Rathbone as its new leader. Millicent would remain a member of the now NUSEC until 1925. Although she never left the women's suffrage movement as a whole, she did now begin to focus a lot more of her time onto her writing, and in the same year received an honorary doctorate from the University of Birmingham. In total, she would write 14 published bits of work in her life, 4 of those after stepping down, mostly works on political and social topics, from everything from women's suffrage, such as Women's Victory in 1920. But there was also a novel, Jane Doncaster, set in her birthplace of Aldborough, and several biographies, including Queen Victoria, early women's rights campaigner Josephine Butler, and then there was of course her own memoirs. On top of this, she also took up new campaigns to give women access into the world of law, equal divorce rights, and better education standards for young girls and women in India. She was honoured in the 1925 New Year's Honours List as a Dame Grand Cross Order of the British Empire, making her Dame Millicent Garrett Fawcett. 1928 she saw what had been pretty much her life's work established, with the passing of the Representation of the People Equal Franchise Act of 1928. It gave the right to vote to all women over the age of 21, regardless of wealth, passing on the 2nd of July 1928. Millicent was delighted by this victory that she and so many others had fought and in some cases died for. It is almost exactly 61 years ago since I heard John Stuart Mill introduce his suffrage amendment to the Reform Bill of May 20th, 1867. So I have had extraordinary good luck to have seen the struggle from the beginning. Just over a year later, on the 5th of August 1929, Millicent died in her home of No. 2 Gower Street, Bloomsbury, London, aged 82. It was the home of her sister that she had moved into following the death of her husband. She was cremated in Golders Green Crematorium. The location of where her ashes are scattered afterwards is not known. One of her obituaries read, "Had there been no militancy and no war, the emancipation of women would still have come, although more slowly. But without the fateful preparation of the ground over many years by Dame Millicent Fawcett and her colleagues, neither militancy nor the war would have produced the crop." Millicent is an odd woman to place, very much of the time of her birth, very much a Victorian. She stood for the vote, but opposed free education and the welfare state. The reason she eventually quit the NUSEC was over this. She was also anti any form of birth control, and in many ways saw the entire world as very black and white. She was quick to cut out anyone of her life who crossed what she saw as her moral lines. A once close friend, Elizabeth Wolstenholme Elmy, became pregnant before she was married. When Millicent found out, she never spoke to her again. Despite being labelled as one since, she never seems to have called herself a feminist. In fact, it's possible that she hated the idea. When given a copy of The Free Woman, a weekly feminist magazine in the early 20th century, she tore it to pieces, calling it objectionable and mischievous. But in the long run, it seems that she did far more good than she did wrong. The campaigns she led are too numerous to mention here, but on screen are a list of the ones I could find, and I do apologise if I have missed any causes or actions she undertook off the list. Her two surviving family members, her sister Agnes, would live until 1935 at the age of 89, and her daughter Philippa went on to teach in the very college her mother had helped establish, and worked on London County Council, before passing away on the 10th of June 1948, aged 80. Memorials to her sprung up very soon after her death. The first being Millicent Fawcett Hall, that was constructed in 1929 in Westminster, and was a place for women's debates and discussions. The building is now used as a theatre for Westminster School. In 1932, a memorial to her and her husband was erected in Westminster Abbey, carrying the inscription, "A wise, constant, and courageous Englishwoman. She won citizenship for women." St Felix School, near her birthplace in Suffolk, named one of its buildings after her. In 1953, the London and National Society for Women's Services changed its name to the Fawcett Society, a group that is still in operation today and are the current holders of the brooch mentioned before. In 1954, a blue plaque was placed by her In 1954, a blue plaque was placed by London County Council on her home of 45 years in Bloomsbury, and this would mark the end of memorials to her for a while, until 2018 and the 100th anniversary of the passing of the first bills. The London School of Economics, whose library holds much of her archives now, renamed one of their buildings Fawcett House. And BBC Radio 4 announced that she had been voted the winner of a poll of the most influential women of the past 100 years. And the Millicent Fawcett Mile, an annual 1-mile race for women, was also inaugurated in 2018. And last, but by certainly no means least, following a campaign led by Caroline Emma Criado Perez that gained 84,000 signatures online, a statue of her was erected in Parliament Square, designed by Gillian Waring. It's the first to commemorate a woman to be placed there. It depicts her as she was at the time she took over the leadership of the NUWSS, holding a banner carrying an extract from one of her speeches. She wears the brooch she was awarded in 1913, and around the base of the statue was engraved the names of 55 women and 4 men who were key in the fight to women's suffrage. It was unveiled on the 24th of April 2018 by the then Prime Minister Theresa May, who said, "I would not be standing here today as Prime Minister. No female MPs would have taken their seats in Parliament. None of us would have the rights we now enjoy, were it not for one truly great woman, Dame Millicent Garrett Fawcett." I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. All of the information and pictures used can be found in the description below. Please feel free to like and subscribe if you wish. This was Dame Millicent Garrett Fawcett, a Suffolk suffragist, and this was a little bit of history.